Good evening, I'm Suzanne. Okay. Good evening, I'm Suzanne Ellsbury, co-president of the League of Women Voters, Charlotte-Mecklenburg. I'd like to welcome all the League members and supporters of the League to our November's virtual League Talk. If you're not a member of the League yet, we hope you'll decide to join our organization. During the meeting, if you will, please keep your mics on mute until you're recognized to speak, and put your questions and comments in the chat box, and our speaker will address them as soon as to as many as she can by the end of her talk. And it would be helpful, but not necessary, if you place a Q in front of your questions and a C preceding your comments. I'd like to recognize some special people here tonight. The first, of course, is my co-president, Reagan Aduddle. So Reagan, you want to give us okay, she's not on the video, but welcome. And we have Dolores Hurd, who's our past president. Dolores served the League for 5 long years. And but really, Dolores, we miss you. Let's see who else is here. Kevin Woodson. Kevin, you're with us. Kevin is a former board member, and currently he is the president of the senior Dems. Let's see. What else is here? Oh, Connie Green. Connie Green Johnson's been a League member for ages, and she's very well known for supporting all the voters, and also Connie has run for office, and I think she's involved now in some sort of initiative to register rural voters in North Carolina, which is and she had a visit to the White House even. So that's great. So that's it for the invitation, the introductions. I think, is anybody else here that would like to be introduced or oh, I know, I forgot. Sarah Matthews is here. She's a senior director with the Carter Center that Mayor Roberts is going to be talking about tonight. And she's signed in with us, and we're so delighted to have you, Sarah. Okay, thank you all for attending. Does anybody have any announcements they would like to make before we start with the program? Okay. Then we'll just jump right in. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, who's a familiar face to us all, as she served as Charlotte's 58th mayor and 4-term county commissioner, Mayor Jennifer Watson Roberts. Mayor Roberts is a tireless champion for many causes dear to the League, among them education, equality, and environmental justice. In her new role leading the North Carolina initiative of the Carter Center, she will enlighten us this evening about their program for promoting conflict resolution and nonviolence in the 2022 elections. Mayor Roberts, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Suzanne, and it's great to see so many friends and so many people who care about our community. I think I know almost everybody, but I know also that a lot of you have been public servants, have worked on educating folks on the principles of our democracy, and are committed to continuing to uphold those principles. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And so while I'm speaking, I'm going to end with a question, and I want you all to be thinking about how this organization could be part of this initiative and help in what we're trying to do. Those of you who, everyone knows the Carter Center name. Everyone is familiar with the work the Carter Center has done in trying to keep peace around the globe, and especially in monitoring elections, in having nonpartisan, unaffiliated observers to help have elections be fair and safe, to help support the idea of democracy in other countries that have struggled that have come out of monarchies and autocracies and are working to build democracy. Well, 2020 was the first year the Carter Center turned to the US. And there were indications early on that this would not be a regular election, that there would be challenges to our democracy that we've never seen, and that the experience the Carter Center has had in the Middle East, in Sudan, in some very difficult, conflict-ridden areas, that the experience they bring to the table would be helpful in our own country. So I'm going to share my screen because I have slides. Some of these charts are going to be very interesting. So let me just get it so I'm only looking at myself. Okay. So that's my email address at the Carter Center, and I'm hugging a tree because it is very grounding and makes you feel really good. So if next time you feel depressed, go out and hug a tree. I'm calling this the Strengthening Democracy Initiative. There are various names it's taken on, and to be honest, we haven't figured out the best way to name it for North Carolina because there are 7 states where the Carter Center is going to be active over the next year, and each state may have a different way that connects with voters in that state to help describe it. But right now I'm going to call it Strengthening Democracy. So what we have seen in the past several decades is an increasing polarization in the United States. And you can read it too, that 2 decades ago, the average partisan differences were only a little bit wider than differences in things like religious attendance, educational attainment, blacks and whites. And what this shows is a survey of people of how they feel the division is, how different they feel if they're in one of the groups from the other group. And so if you look at this chart, and you can see there's race, religious attendance, education, age, and gender. And those differences don't have people feeling like they are that separated. But if you look at political party and where it has come from 1994 to now, a difference in opinion of 36 points in terms of how much conflict people feel and how much they feel that polarization. And that is something that we feel in everyday life when we listen to the news. And there are a number of factors that have contributed to this increasing polarization. There's some political scientists who say we are more polarized now than we've been since the Civil War. And those are the kinds of statements that really frighten historians and people who care about democracy. So in looking at some of the factors that have led us to be more divided, we have different demographics now than we did 30 years ago. Our foreign-born population was 4.7%. Now it's 14, maybe even 15%. 45 million people come from different cultural identities. This one is really important. Closed media ecosystems. You know what year both Fox News and MSNBC got started? 1996. So before 1996, we didn't have like one place you could go and get your predetermined perspective on the news as you want to hear it, right? People have been sorting the news since 1996, and Fox News actually started with the express purpose of supporting the Republican Party and conservative values. And so it's interesting when you think about how do you get your news, the sources you go to, it's TV or radio or publications. We know exactly what position different papers have, different periodicals have. Some of them claim, CNN claims to be sort of down the middle, but depending on what you look at, some people say it leans one way or the other. But the Wall Street Journal is more conservative, the New York Times is more progressive, and that goes for a lot of our media. We also find that people continue to turn to the same source for their information, and therefore they're always getting that one perspective. Rising income inequality. We know that 30 years ago, the difference between the lowest paid worker and the highest paid worker at most companies was about 40. Well, now it's well over 400. So we have CEOs who are making multiple millions and millions of dollars, whereas we've been fighting for 15 for our lowest paid workers for quite a while. And we know the federal minimum wage is not anywhere near sufficient to actually let people support themselves. That income inequality is noticeable, and more people are aware of it. And we know that that wealth accumulation has added to the polarization as people feel very divided by opportunity. There's also a growing awareness of racial inequality. This has happened because people have smartphones, and they are getting videos of police brutality. They are getting videos of discrimination. They are able to report in real time when people are mistreated and when the racism is open and obvious. And again, that's something I can't remember when I got my first smartphone, but it was less than 30 years ago. And people have gotten much more accustomed to taking video, to doing it live. All of those apps that we have, there's growing awareness of inequality, and the death of George Floyd and the protests there. The revisiting of history around the Wilmington Massacre, the Greensboro Massacre, the Tulsa Massacre, things that people weren't taught in school. Certainly I wasn't, and many white people were not taught that. We are now more aware of that. And again, that's leading to some of our polarization. We have a declining trust in institutions. This has been greatly compounded by a president who refused to accept election results and former president, continues to propagate the steal, the election that was stolen. And many news sources continue to carry that lie because we know it was probably the most secure, most reviewed and watched over election that we've had in our history. And electronics has helped us do that. We had observers on both sides, both parties, but we are less and less trusting of institutions. COVID also did not help because we, again, politicized science. We politicized what we were hearing from doctors and experts and began to distrust places like the CDC and the National Institutes of Health, which is not something that has happened until recently. We also are doing what's called the Great Sort. Some of you may have read that book, but it is our tendency more and more to seek out communities with like-minded people. I've even heard people say they look for the Democratic signs or the Republican candidate signs in people's yards before they decide which neighborhood they want to go to. I've heard people say that. And so we are sorting ourselves, and that leads to polarization because we don't have direct contact to people who think differently from how we think. This last one, group status downgrade, is kind of an academic term. But what it means is there is a group, and right now it's mainly white men, who feel that they are losing their status as the dominant power in our society. And so when they feel that, and white women have that to an extent from race, educated people have that to an extent when they see rural power. So other groups besides white men can feel this status downgrade, but what it leads to is a fear of losing a position that you've had of privilege, that you may not call it that, some people don't want to call it that, but that's what it has been. And if a large group feels like it's losing that status, it wants to cling to that through whatever means it can, and that increases the sense of polarization. I also pulled a chart from, we always want to think about where do we fit in the world? Are we, is our media separation worse than other countries? And turns out that, yeah, we're pretty bad. This is just a snapshot of a chart from 2021. And again, these are surveys of people who feel divided. They feel the conflict, and how do they feel about what's going on in their country. When it looks at politics, we are, and I tried to darken our dot a little bit, we are tied with South Korea at 90%. People feel that politics divides us. And what's interesting is when you get down to the urban-rural divide, it's not as bad as we think it might be. It's about 42% of people in America feel like that's a big challenge and a polarization. Our religious differences are not as bad as they could be. And in differing ethnic and racial backgrounds, we're pretty bad. We're at 71% of the population feels that that's an area of conflict. So we're pretty much at the top of a lot of these challenges. Looks like South Korea is near us in a lot of ways, and France on some of these, but the U.S. Is not doing very well when it comes to that polarization and that sense of conflict. So there are a few behavioral and psychological underpinnings to this rising polarization. And we've gotten to where belonging is more important than facts. And we've seen this in political arguments. When there's one concept that one political party supports, and then all of a sudden the leader of that party doesn't support it, well, then everybody decides to follow suit and not support it as well. I mean, people have actually flip-flopped on issues, and the followers in that belonging group follow suit. And sometimes it's even counterproductive to their own interests. But that belonging is more important. People don't even read the facts. They want to be recognized as part of that group. Or they want to hide the fact that they know the facts might be different, because it's very important for them to be part of that belonging. We also see that liberal and conservative differences in moral upbringing, in our moral formation, are deeper than they have been. The sense of morality, the sense of right and wrong, the sense of judging, in your upbringing, in the way that you take in the news and learn and look at history and are curious and humble in wanting to learn. That has led to a difference. And there are even some brain scientists who think that we are predisposed in our brains, in the way that we are made up, to respond to different stimuli. That there are certain people who are more inclined to be empathetic and to care about the plight of people who are poor or people who are in different circumstances, and others who are more inclined to say it's their own fault. And that leads to the story and the narrative in our political ideology. So politics has become our identity. And, this is a quote from 2018. I mean, it's gotten even more polarized since then. But our political parties are growing socially polarized. So religion, race, class, geography, culture are dividing the parties so that our identities are totally tied up in the political party. And you've read about the Whole Foods? If you have a Whole Foods within certain miles of your house, that means you're in a Democratic neighborhood. I mean, they've even been able to connect grocery stores to political identity. So partisanship is now thought of as a mega identity. And that, again, contributes to our polarization. So what are the top threats? The Carter Center is very interested in reducing violence, in trying to spread the norm of nonviolence, political action. Protests are great, but not violent protests. And they're looking at where are the threats, the top threats to democracy and the drivers of violence. And I wanted to make sure I put a left-wing and a right-wing image. So you have an all-black militia in Louisville. And then, of course, the bottom right is a familiar picture of the Capitol police and guards cowering in the Capitol building as the right-wing protesters entered and were smashing windows and coming in. So we've got violence on both sides. One of the reasons that people feel powerless and frustrated and take to violence, we have counter majoritarian structures. Big term. What that means is, okay, think about the US Senate. There are what, 40 million more Democrats in this country? But in the US Senate, it's equally split by a hair. And it's because we have huge states in the West, like Montana and Wyoming, that have the same two senators that California, with its 40 million people, has, with the same votes. That is counter majoritarian because it does not represent the majority vote. The Electoral College is another example that you all are very familiar with, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But this political sectarianism and the media silos together have damaged our norms and the accountability to an electoral system, to elections in general, to a system where every vote counts, where votes are valid, where we can be transparent and secure in the outcomes of those elections. All of these, the fake news and the misinformation, and I think that's my next point. The misinformation is so rapid and so prevalent. Not only do we have misinformation from groups here, but we know there are Russian bots who are coming in and responding to tags on Facebook and Twitter, etc., with misinformation. We know that they intruded in the 2016 election. There's probably Chinese intrusion as well. There are a lot of places around the world that want to mess with what's going on. And with social media and the lack, as we've seen, of control from Twitter, from Facebook, from Instagram, it's really hard to counter misinformation quickly enough. What was it Mark Twain said, that a lie travels around the world before the truth can put on its pants? And that's still true, except for now we have much better techniques and technology for spreading it. And these are not all the top threats, these are just the top four that I wanted to talk about. There are others that you probably can think about: threats to our democracy, drivers of violence, the prevalence of guns in our communities. That is absolutely a driver of violence because they're accessible, they're not traceable. We have, different laws in different states. There's a gun show loophole. Anyway, that's just one more thing that's leading to more and more violence. So I just thought of a few things in North Carolina that we are all familiar with lately that are driving our polarization. The whole mask divide, the anti-vaxxers, masks, the critical race theory has become a huge divide. And of course, issues of LGBTQ equality, whether it's in the schools or in the community at large. The LGBTQ people now are going after transgender women in sports. So it's, there's always a way to divide people around that. Redistricting, I know Harry Taylor is on, Mr. No Gerrymander. So you all know all about the gerrymandering and how that drives our polarization. The struggle we've divided government. We have a General Assembly and a governor from different parties, and there have been a lot of vetoes. So, and we didn't have a budget for 3 years, for Pete's sake, because we finally have one this year. I have mixed feelings about that, but we didn't have one for 3 years because they couldn't agree and they couldn't override a veto, and so we had stalemate. So that's polarization. Faith-based exclusions, RFRA, religious freedom, of carving out of having to follow the policies that other people follow. That again has led to polarization even within the faith community. We have I have ministers come tell me that they have purple churches. They've got conservatives and progressives, and they're afraid to bring up anything political because it just leads to a fight. And so that's a big challenge. Racial injustice, as I said before, people are much more aware of it. It's a huge issue in North Carolina. We have had our massacres. We have the KKK hanging out in Johnson County. We've got Proud Boys. We have a lot of background and history around racial injustice. Recently, there was someone who was freed who was wrongly convicted, a black man who'd been in prison for 24 years. Recent court cases, gerrymandering. And court cases not just on gerrymandering, but on criminal justice, on LGBT equality. You know, many times when there's a court decision, it leads to further divide. And then the urban-rural divide in North Carolina. Although, as we've seen, people don't feel that as strongly, but it absolutely is driving polarization. These statistics are also troubling. The support for political violence is rising. Over 1/3 of Americans agree with the statement that our traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast we may have to use force to save it. Over 1/3 of Americans. And among Republicans, it was 55%. Now, we've all read about the revolution, and we know that there are times to rise up against an oppressive government. But oh my gosh, is that the America we see today? This gentleman on the left is from the Proud Boys. And I can't remember what city that picture was taken in, but you know, they're out and proud and very visible. So what the Carter Center has done is they are working with Princeton to gather data to help inform how do we counter this rising sense of violence, this rising polarization. How do we help spread a message of nonviolence, peaceful transfer of power? What made this country so strong? George Washington didn't want to be a king, turned it down, right? Al Gore, after losing by 500 votes, conceded to George Bush. Like, this is our history, peaceful transfer of power. So Princeton is working with the Carter Center to try to figure out where are the most likely places for conflict. Now, it's kind of like your stockbroker tells you, past performance is no prediction of future performance, right? So this is data from the past, from what we see going on in different communities. And they look at 4 different data sets: polarization and social trust. Mobilization, that's the number of people who demonstrate and the size of demonstrations. Violent activity, obviously, events, protests, police-involved shootings and deaths, counter-protest, civil rights cases, and any incidents of violence. They count all those. And political relevance. Are you a battleground state? Are you a place that has a lot of electoral votes and is going to be really important to the national election? That is also something that they're looking at. And the way they look at polarization and social trust, they looked at income inequality, percentage of college educated, decline of non-white population, and the prevalence of COVID protests. So on the right, you see we are ranked out of 3,143 counties in the U.S. We have numbers that come in the top 100. So that's why North Carolina is doing this, and why they've hired me to try to help mitigate the violence that we see, the potential for violence. That picture on the bottom, by the way, is I was there the first day of the George Floyd protest. That gentleman right there has, I don't know, is it an AK-47 or AR-15 slung over his shoulder, and he's got the North Carolina flag, and he's, you know, ready to rumble in the middle of the Black Lives Matter protests. So we do have counter protesters. Here's a chart for North Carolina. Again, looking at our ranking, you can see the polarization, mobilization, violence, and political relevance. Wake County is the top. Not surprising, it's where the seat of North Carolina's government is. Mecklenburg is second, not surprising. We're 1/10 the population. We have, you know, we're the second center of political power and economic power, actually the first center of economic power. We're close. And Wake and Mecklenburg are almost the same size exactly in terms of population. Alamance County is third, then we have New Hanover, Buncombe. So you can see that there are reasons using this matrix that Princeton has come up with. These are areas that we're going to be trying to have some influence in. Mecklenburg is one, so you all could be really helpful. And what we want to think about is what can we do? What can we do to make sure we don't lose all trust in our democratic institutions? We don't have many candidates contesting not just the election and having a recount, but contesting the mechanics and saying that there's rampant fraud, not necessarily justified or supported by evidence, but having a bunch of believers follow them. How do we help build support and engage with each other across party lines to get a message out of let's resolve this, let's restore trust in our institutions, let's have democracy work. This is actually a picture that after the Keith Lamont Scott protests, one of our stores uptown had the windows smashed and somebody wrote "Love, not hate." So how do you counter the hate? Forming cross-partisan groups. Any of you may have heard of Braver Angels? It's a nonprofit that has Republican and Democrat conversations about issues and works to build that sense of community. They're a national group. I get their emails. They've got webinars. And there's also a group in Raleigh that's called Crossing Party Lines. And they, again, try to have conversations. They may have a chapter here. Working on those social ties, working together on common issues. You would think that combating a virus that doesn't care if you're Republican or Democrat and it affects you anyway, you would think that would bring us together and be something that would really help nurture those social ties. We need to look for more ways to do that. We need to look for ways to work together, whether it's finding housing, whether it's working, social outreach, things that we can agree on, caring for our children, supporting our sports teams. We want to strengthen our shared identities, our sense of what it is to be American. What is it to be free? What is it to have the opportunities that we have? And we have to leverage the existing cross-partisan institutions. League of Women Voters is one of those. Democracy North Carolina, Common Cause. There are a number of nonpartisan groups that we want to collaborate with to figure out how do we get this message out and continue to spread a message of peace. This is an example of a really powerful image that was used, if you remember the murder of several folks at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, in Squirrel Hill several years ago. The Pittsburgh Steelers came out with this symbol and said, Pittsburgh is stronger than hate. And so they put a Jewish star in where, usually their little logo star. It was really powerful. And again, sports is one of those things that sometimes can connect us. Sports and the arts. I think that there's a lot of potential there as well. These are a couple of images that the Carter Center had an advertising company come up with, and they were active in Georgia in the Senate runoff elections because they got started in looking at U.S. elections in September of 2020. They didn't have a lot of impact on the national mood. I mean, January 6th still happened, but they feel like they had some impact on the Georgia Senate races. Because they're there in Atlanta, they know Georgia culture, they had a lot of material to work with. And so I don't know if you all recognize the Georgia Bulldogs and the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. My son went to Georgia Tech, so I know all about Buzz, but who's the Yellow Jacket? But they had a picture of those, two mascots and said, if dogs and jackets can get along, so can we. Let's respect each other. And they had something that said the average election official has worked in 7 previous elections. We can trust them. They had a number of other messages and images that they try to get people to share on social media. We also have an idea, and again, the league could help in this. We have the idea to have candidates sign a code of conduct and an agreement to accept election results. Who would have thought this would be a thing in the 21st century? But it is. And so this is not the full pledge. It's just a couple paragraphs from a possible pledge, but you can see we just want people to say, Eligible citizens should have the right to register to vote. Voters can vote freely without unfair intimidation. They should be counted. It's like pretty basic civics 101. But this would be really powerful if we could figure out a way to get candidates on both sides to agree up front that they will follow this kind of a code of ethics. And then the second part of that would be support for nonviolence. So your poll workers are not going to intimidate people, and if you hear they do, you're going to pull them, right? We want people to respect political party, representatives from the other side. No, yelling, no fighting. Organize and contribute to a peaceful atmospheres in pre-election polling, counting, and post-election. Don't use symbols and gestures that are hateful, that are hate speech. Denounce acts of violence. Act with responsibility and dignity toward others. So again, we would think in a civilized society these were no-brainers. We may need a lot of help getting some prominent candidates to sign on to them. Now, we have not formulated this for North Carolina yet. This is a template that was used in Georgia, just pulling some of the main things from it, but the actual document was longer. And again, there's some things specific to North Carolina that we might want to have in there. I just threw up some of the groups that we're going to want to collaborate with. And I have reached out to some, others not yet, but we've got groups on the right and the left and some who are in the middle. Interfaith Ministries, the League of Women Voters, Democracy, all these are supposed to be nonpartisan in the middle. Then we have some on the right, the North Carolina Values Coalition, the John Locke Foundation, Billy Graham. Then we have some on the left, the ACLU and NAACP. We want all of these groups to help us with this messaging. So if you've got other ideas for additional groups, or if people, I know a lot of them, but we can always use additional help in reaching out and participating in agreeing to share this messaging. Oops, I meant to advance the slide and not stop the share. Hold on. Hello, everybody. Okay, I clicked the wrong button. But, so what I want to end with is, and then I'll take it off share, what could be the role for the League of Women Voters? Let's see what my last slide is. And this is just a picture. Their motto is waging peace, fighting disease, building hope. And you can see there's a polling station. They are very concerned about elections. And what I also forgot to say is that I'm not the only one in North Carolina working on this, because when they first contacted me, I said, people know I'm a progressive Democrat. I can't get everybody at the table, maybe because of that. So I need a conservative counterpart. So my counterpart in North Carolina is retired Judge Bob Orr. Many of you may know him. He was on our Supreme Court for several years. I think he's actually unaffiliated now. I think he's no longer a Republican, but he ran as a Republican. He ran statewide as a Republican. He knows people at a lot of these, a lot of the right-leaning groups, and he will be my counterpart as we continue to reach out to the various groups. So that's I tried to finish so we have time for discussion and ideas. I know it's a lot of information in a short time, but we truly need to support democracy. The fact that over a third of our country thinks it's time to take up arms against our government is pretty frightening to me. And the fact that people still think there was a stolen election, they're convinced. And we have the opportunity to try to get ahead of some of the violence and some of the lies and misinformation, but we have to build some relationships, and we have to work with both parties, because every candidate should be willing to adhere to the basic principles and to have a civic election election season and not be intimidating people. And I know I was actually working with Democracy, or I was a volunteer with Democracy NC at the 2020 elections, and stood outside of a poll and made sure people felt safe and there was nobody yelling at them and that kind of thing. We had a lot of people, a lot of volunteers doing that, which helped. But we're going to need to do that again in 2022. And this is a build up for 2024. So there's a lot that the Carter Center is trying for the first time. They want to see what's effective, what works, because 2024 is going to be that's the final exam, right? This is going to be the pop quiz. Well, not the pop quiz, we know about it. But let me tell you the 7 states. When they did the Princeton data collection and analysis, there's some that won't surprise you. North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Arizona. And then the other 3 are Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so all of those states scored high on that ranking of counties that have had past conflict, that have greater polarization, that are battleground states, where it's going to mean a lot, whatever election comes out. There are Senate elections, the U.S. Senate. I mean, we've got one. Georgia has one. There are, of course, Arizona got a lot of attention last election in Maricopa County, and they counted like 4 times, I think, they had to recount, because they elected a Democrat, and like Republicans, that can't have happened. So that's 7 states, and eventually I'll be working in cohort with the 7 states. We'll be sharing information, what's working in your state, what's another idea. And we want as many people as possible to be engaged in spreading the message. One more thing to think about. We're also looking for a group of people, maybe 15 or 30 statewide, who would be willing to actually go through training with Carter Center folks, and maybe have monthly meetings, maybe review messaging that's going to go out to help us. Is this culturally appropriate? Is this offensive to anybody? Is this bringing us together? It's always helpful to get 20 different people looking at the same image to say, is this offensive? Because sometimes if you're not of that group, you don't know. So we're also looking for people who'd be willing to put some real time into it as volunteers to help guide this process. So I had a couple asks at the end there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mayor Roberts. You've given us so much to digest and think about. And I had read quite a bit about the Carter Center program, but you introduced a lot of new information, and I was just fascinated, riveted. Thank you. We're going to go to a Q&A, but I didn't notice anything in the chat. So I had a few questions to sort of start us off. Most of them you answered already. One question I had was, and I think you answered this pretty well, but the League is nonpartisan, but we're still a political organization. And what role specifically do you envision for our participation in the program?
Well, that's what we want to discuss, because the League is statewide, and we know that it is nonpartisan, but we also know there is a perception that it leans progressive. So what we really need help with, because we actually have a lot of progressives who are very interested in this, who are very worried. We need to actually find more conservative leaning folks to be part of reading the messaging, getting out to the candidates to get them to sign on, helping really support that as a norm of civic behavior, that you don't let your campaign workers taunt people of color or intimidate them or, heaven forbid, throw things at them. In Georgia, you can't even give water to people, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. But we want to really find both people from both parties. And so since the League it's political but nonpartisan, I'm hoping that with all the contacts you have around the state, that you can help us really identify some of those who are conservative leaning who would be willing to be part of that network. They call them resilience networks. We're going to come up with a better name, but it's really an advisory group that is going to help us with the messaging. By the way, it's also a two-way flow of information. So if you've got people in Alamance County, because that's the third most likely to erupt county, if there are people there who hear of something happening or hear of a gathering or see it on Facebook, we can't monitor everything all the time. And there's a challenge with working too closely with police because the police are perceived by some as being totally on the right. Even though I have a lot of friends who are police officers, wonderful people, again, it's the sense of, we want to have a community support as well as law enforcement. We want to have community-led people in those communities, in those different demographics, different parties, who are willing to step up and be leaders and say, I believe these are principles we can all support, right? Wouldn't it be great if Tom Tillis would stand up and say that? I mean, I'm serious. Wouldn't it be great if Tom Tillis, if anybody has ties to Tom Tillis and he's willing to, he's not up for election, but for him to step up and say that, clearly, Pat McCrory, Ted Budd need to say this. We need to get everybody to support basic democratic principles and carrying out of fair, free, and safe elections.
That begs my next question. Is like, okay, you're trying to enlist people. How specifically does the program in North Carolina propose to enlist the support and participation of creditable right of center participants? So what's your process here?
So it's going to be through connections. Bob Orr is still very respected. He was a Supreme Court justice. Judges are seen to be fair, and he was elected as a Republican. And so if I don't have a direct connection, actually, I saw Dan Bishop at an event recently. I've got Dan Bishop's cell phone number. I'm going to get him to sign on to it. We served together as county commissioners. I disagree with a lot of things he stands for, but I want him to support our democracy. And, I want him to support fair and free elections. So I have some contacts.
Networking, right? Networking. And connections. Yeah. Well, one more question from me. This is a personal question and you can refuse to answer, but knowing you won't. What particularly attracted you to your new position with the Carter Center?
Well, I tell you what I have seen in the past 8 years. Even, when I first was on the county commission in 2004, things were different. I could talk to colleagues across the aisle. And, in 2004, Mecklenburg County was very purple. We had 4 Republicans and 5 Democrats on the commission. We had to really work together because, if you lose one vote, you don't get things to pass. And so you really have to, in a split council like that, you have to work together. And I didn't find myself ridiculed when I, worked with people on the other side, when I got collaboration and all that. It's gotten a lot nastier. And what I saw in reading the Princeton information and also just looking at the response to school boards right now and public health officials. Oh my gosh, public health officials didn't sign up for this. They didn't run for election. They're just trying to help cure people and keep people alive. And they've gotten death threats because people are so anti-vax or anti-science or just angry. I got death threats, but not like people are getting now. And the emails have gotten nastier. The spread of misinformation is much worse. The ability to spread misinformation has grown tremendously. When I first ran for office, people actually told me, you don't have to have a website. You can do a lot of stuff just on the ground talking to people. 2004, you don't have to have a website. Oh my gosh, you've got to have not just a website, but you've got to have every form of social media to be, every day you got to be tweeting or doing something on Facebook or whatever, or people think that you're not serving. And it's just a very, very different environment. I remember, I ran for Congress in 2012 when Sue Myrick retired. And I remember talking to Sue, even in 2012, and she said, Jennifer, when I first came to Congress, I had lunch with Democrats and Republicans. The women in Congress would have lunch together because there were so few of us. But we also found that we had a lot more in common as women, as the minority in that voice in Congress. She said by the time she retired, she had to have two separate going away parties because the Republican congresswomen wouldn't go to a party with Democratic congresswomen and vice versa. So she had one where the Democrats could say goodbye to her and one where the Republicans could say goodbye to her.
Yeah,
And I thought,
your point is well taken about being polarized. Louise Woods has an excellent question on the chat. Louise, would you like me to read it or would you like to ask it yourself? Okay. Jennifer, will you publicize the candidates who sign or do not sign the pledge?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you all can help with that if you've got Facebook, Twitter, etc. Personally, you can do it in your personal account. The league can do it. Again, we want both sides to be doing it. And you could say something, look how great it is that Dan Bishop signed on to peaceful, non-intimidating electoral practices, right? And he's going to accept the results. Good for him. I know it'll be hard to do that for some Democrats, but but we need to be more supportive of our system of democracy. It needs to go beyond our party affiliation. Because if we truly believe that our government has gotten so far away from us and is so broken that we have to take up arms to save it, we might as well, just give up, because then we're going to have a revolution. And, it's interesting to read the pundits talking about January 6th. There's some people who've compared it to other countries that had coups. And they said, when you go back through all the data and you look at the predetermined, the planning, the tour of the Capitol building ahead of time, the emails that went back and forth, we came close. We came a lot closer than people want to admit to themselves, because it's just so frightening. And the fact that the Carter Center, who's been for decades, has been looking globally and trying to support democracy and not worried about the U.S. and our strong democracy, and now that they're worried about us, that really spoke to me. The Carter Center actually reached out to me in 2020 as a former elected official, and I went to a few trainings and had some meetings, and again, it was kind of too little too late. But it was interesting to see that what they did in Georgia, and then how hard they tried to avoid, exactly what happened on January 6th. But they didn't do enough ahead. So we're trying to do more ahead of time. And I just feel so strongly that, democracy is the basis of everything. We're not going to have racial justice. We're not going to have affordable housing. We're not going to have an economy that works for everyone if we don't have democracy. It's, if we think it's tough now, wait till we have a dictatorship. So I think it's just basic to our survival as a country.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. You continue to amaze me in a good way. Does anybody else have a question, a burning question before we close? Lucille, you want to unmute Lucille Howard?
I put a question / statement in the chat that it seems like the league's role could be correcting misinformation. And we, as a progressive, I myself jumped to a lot of conclusions about the new voting laws that are being enacted across the nation. And yet, if you look at some of the provisions of those laws that were perhaps rejected, North Carolina doesn't have that either. I mean, we don't have drive-through voting. We also have dead zones, for when a candidate or anybody can actually approach a voter outside of the voting booth. And I tried to find out, I didn't get it done, but how far that not giving water goes in Georgia, because it seemed to me that that was, if you're inside the voting, or anyway, I didn't find that out, and I just think that maybe we need to research some of those things and see really how bad they are, and try to let some of us know that we shouldn't be jumping to conclusions about how bad things are.
Right. Well,
Sorry.
we're a little after 8 o'clock. If no one has any announcements or anything to add, I'd like to once again thank Mayor Roberts for speaking to us tonight. I know all of us join me in wishing you great success in your leadership of this interesting and unique approach to assure peaceful and just elections for 2020 and beyond. Thank you. Thank you. From a fellow tree hugger. I hope everyone will join us next month on December the 8th for Lunch with the League at 11:30 to 1, when District 6 City Councilman Tariq Bakari is our featured speaker. And if there's nothing more, I wish you all a good evening.
Please do email me if you have ideas. And if you want to step up and be part of the folks who are looking at the messaging, would love to have you help out.
Absolutely.
I just put my Carter Center email in the chat.
Great, great. I would be interested in volunteering for your volunteer group for the training.
Great.
I imagine a lot of other people would too.
Great. That's fabulous. No, I think the league is
my name on your list.
I am. I've got you written down. I think the league is uniquely poised to really help with this. I mean, you run candidate debates, you do the televised debates here. Getting that other suggestion about correcting misinformation, that's great, because there are some things that, to be honest, people on the left also blow out of proportion because they want to rouse people up, right? It happens on both sides, although I think it happens more on one side than the other. But but we can all be part of making it better. And I really do hope that some people agree to help out. And I'll be reaching out to a lot of groups in North Carolina and hoping that we can really get some good trainings and some people dedicated to working with candidates and with candidate campaigns, and saying you gotta spread nonviolence. You gotta talk about the fact that let the system work. So ask for recount. That's fine. That's in the rules.
Right. Okay, well, we wish everybody a good night, and thank you again so much for coming, and a special thank you for Mayor Roberts.
Good to see Louise and Connie and Dolores and Kevin, Carolyn, Mary, and Charles. Good to see everybody.
And great to have Sarah here with us from the Carter Center.
And Sarah, I'd love to hear your feedback.
Yeah.
Since you're very familiar with the Carter Center. You can send it to me by email if you want. Oh, no, you're gonna say a few things?
I wanted to check to see if that I could unmute again. It was not doing that for me earlier. I want to thank you. Mayor Roberts. Appreciate, and I want to underscore everything you said. It's right on. If I could add just one small thing is to assure people that the Carter Center, which was founded in 1982, has 5 founding principles. One key one here is that we are nonpartisan. We seek to work with higher levels of people to bring stakeholders together, and that's exactly what Mayor Roberts and her team are going to be doing. So please do what you can to support her efforts, because I think it's going to be a very, very interesting 2 years ahead of us, 3 years. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Sarah, for your comments. We really appreciate that. And I double down on that. It's going to be quite an interesting future. And I'm so glad the league is a part of it. And I'm so glad the Carter Center is a part of it too. And I really hope we can work together and complement each other, because we have the same goal, freedom for voters. So
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I have faith our system is strong enough to survive. But it takes all of us.
good to hear. Yeah.
Takes all of us.
Yeah.
So
Well, good night, everybody. I have to go let my dog out.
who let the dogs out?